Thanks to our audience for joining us and our panelists. My name is Sekou Franklin, and I'm the president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Again, thank you for joining this conversation. This conversation is being recorded. We also posted on YouTube, including individual segments of the panelists. And you can find us at our Twitter page at NCOBPS Tweets. And also you can find us on Facebook if you want to see posts of this conversation. For those of you who are new to NCOBPS, our organization has been around since 1969. We have a diverse group of scholars, both faculty and students, and administrators who are committed to research, scholar activism, and mentorship. Before getting started, I want to acknowledge our past presidents who may be on the call, our executive council, including our vice president, Tiffany Willoughby Herard, and Kathie Stromile Golden, our executive director, who will also be moderating today's discussion. Tonight's discussion is titled African Americans and the State of Polling in the 2020 Election. Our esteemed panelists offer a different look at elections, at election polls, the methodology of polling, and the broader terrain of Black political behavior and how it's analyzed in relationship to polling. So I want to thank our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, who's going to introduce our panelists. And I should say that this event is being recorded, and we have, I think, maybe a couple of journalists who are viewing this conversation, and they may want to contact the panelists after this event. Our moderator is Dr. Kathie Stromile Golden. She's a provost and senior vice president for academic affairs at Mississippi Valley State University. She has served as a director of international programs and a special assistant to the president at Mississippi Valley State. And she has served as a project director for the Mississippi Consortium for International Development's Higher Education and Development Project for Iraq. She has traveled to more than 70 countries working on international education programs. And in 2019, she was awarded the Student Faculty Diversity Pipeline Award for the American Association for Public Opinion Research. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Golden, who will introduce the panelists.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We have an esteemed panel to discuss this most important topic. So we will begin with the dean, who is David C. Wilson, and he's really the dean of the panel, but he's also the senior associate dean of arts and sciences and professor of political science and international relations. He holds joint appointments in the Department of Psychological and Brain something, as well as Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. David specializes in polls, public opinion, and political psychology. He previously worked for the Gallup Polling Organization as a senior statistical consultant. He's a member of the task force on 2020 pre-election polling of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and he serves on the Advisory Council for Public Opinion Quarterly. And in his spare time, he's an avid cyclist, and I don't know what else, David. Our second panelist, and she's by no means second, but she's second on this panel, is Camille D. Burge, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Villanova University. Her research interests lie at the intersection of political psychology and racial and ethnic politics. She is a member of the task force on 2020 pre-election polling of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. She is also one of the lead investigators of the Rural Survey NCOBPS is co-sponsoring with the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation. Ray Block is our third panelist. Ray is an associate professor at Penn State University. He is the co-author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. His research interests include racial, ethnic, and gender differences in civic involvement, campaigns, and elections. He is also a senior research analyst for the African American Research Collaborative and Latino Decisions. Ray was one of the lead investigators of a 9,400 person poll during the 2018 midterm election, and one of the lead investigators of the 15,000 person 2020 American Election Eve poll. Each panelist will have 8 to 10 minutes to share their thoughts. I will keep time and I will say beep, beep when your time, 2 minutes. Okay, so we will start with, and excuse me for not being as formal as the young people are, but I'm a senior citizen, so I'm gonna take my privilege and say, David.
Thank you, Kathie. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you, Sekou. Thank you, NCOBPS, for putting on the panel. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides to just kind of organize a talk and share on the back end if anybody's interested. So let me share that screen for a second. All right, good to go, Kathie? Thumbs up?
Yes.
All right. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of kind of some aspects of the art and science of polling analysis and do it within the time limit, of course. But some of the major points about why we do polls get missed when you pay too much attention to the media narratives. The first thing to keep in mind is that the reason we have polls and surveys around elections and we try and understand voting behavior is because we don't collect racial ethnic data of registered voters across the United States. In many states, mostly those that have civil rights acts, history of civil rights act violations, were required to keep that kind of information up to a certain point, and now they've been released from that. But most of the voter registration data does not come with racial ethnic data, and so we have to rely on public opinion polls and surveys to help us understand how the electorate is behaving and what are the reasons behind voting behavior. Now, you might see in the news that there are many different narratives about polling error and polls being broken because they're not getting elections correct. But in reality, we're doing better at polling than we've ever done. You can see from the, and I'll just kind of point to it, you can see from this trend that over the last 70 years or so, we've improved our ability to get national polls accurate. We have more issues at the state level because more kinds of error come into play. So the graphic on the right side shows 2016, where we have the most comprehensive presidential election data right now. And you can see that as you move from the left side of the chart to the right side, not only do you see a decreasing gap in the estimates, but you see the little shading area around the lines also decreasing. What that means is as you collect more and more data around an election, you get closer and closer to what the actual estimate is. When people see that polls get it wrong or polls have gotten it wrong, they're thinking about it the wrong way. One poll is just one data point in a distribution of data. And so you should expect that out of 100 polls, about 5% of the time, they'll get it wrong in some way or another. And that's just due to sampling error. So the key thing to remember is, yes, there are challenges with polls. They're not perfect, but they do have very small amounts of error when we look at the national electorate. So my main point, and I've been asked to talk about this a little bit by Sekou, is to talk about the margin of error, and that the thing to keep in mind is that the margin of error is only the error that's due to sampling. It's only error due to sampling size. Sampling error has a pretty straightforward formula, and it makes some basic assumptions about what you're trying to do within a certain level of confidence. So as your N size increases, your sample size increases for any given poll, your margin of error decreases. And usually the margin of error assumes that you have a 95% confidence interval. So this is pretty much known. You can plug it into most calculators and find the margin of error. For example, if you're interested in a 3% margin of error, you can either look at this chart or you can plug in the data, and it pretty much tells you that as you increase your sample size to 1,000, you reduce your error from almost 30, 40% down to about 3 percentage points. Now, you'll also notice that this line never reaches zero, because no matter how much data you collect, if you're surveying, if you're sampling, you're going to always have error. So you can never get to zero error, but as you increase your sample size, you can reduce that error. The thing to keep in mind also is that even if you do have a relatively small margin of error that represents your survey, it doesn't mean that your analysis has the same margin of error. You can see from this kind of graphic, this is an Ipsos Reuters poll from late October. And you can see as you move along the line to who you're trying to understand, whether it's Democratic voters or independent voters, you're decreasing your sample size, which means you're increasing your margin of error. So if someone is saying something about Democratic registered voters, that error is not the same as the error that exists for the study. So in many cases, when the media talks about who's voting for whom and for what reasons, that error that they're reporting is for the study, but the error for the actual analysis that explains why and what's going on is actually much larger. And that's something that most journalists don't really take into consideration or understand. So one example, of course, is that when we look at point estimates between candidates, here you have a Democratic candidate at 43% and a Republican candidate at 48%, that 5 percentage point gap, you can see the estimates overlap. These dots in the middle are called point estimates, and the little wings around them are called the margin of error or the confidence interval for that point estimate. In statistics, we can look at whether or not two confidence intervals overlap to see if they're different. But in polling, we take things a little bit more serious. There's actually some science behind this, and we're asking a different question when we look at the margin or the gap between two candidates. So looking at the estimate for the candidate is not the same as looking at the difference in the estimates between the two candidates. Those actually have two different formulas. So while you may see a small margin of error due to high sample, it doesn't mean that that small margin translates to the actual interpretation of the data. And I just provide a few examples. Each of the different types of error have different formulas. They're all in your basic textbooks, or you can enter them in different calculators. But if we're looking at the margin of error for a study and we find that Biden has 52%, we can actually say that his actual population support is anywhere between 49 and 55. But if we're going to compare his number across another response category, here you see a 10 percentage point gap. And if you look at the 3.1% error, you're going to miss. You're going to say, oh, these things are different. They're outside of the margin. But now we're asking a different question when we compare these two. We're asking, is that 10 percentage point gap statistically different from zero, right? And that's a different question. And then if we're trying to look across different studies to look at a trend and say, okay, this survey was done last week, and hey, we see Biden now has 2 percentage points more. Is that statistically different? Well, it has a completely different margin of error, as does an estimate for a different candidate. So you have a single estimate for a single question. You have 2 points within a single question for an estimate. And then you have different surveys, and you're looking across those surveys. So your margin of error is very important for understanding your data, but it's just based on sample size, and the kind of error that you're looking at differs depending on your question. The second point I want to make is that just having a larger N size doesn't mean your data is more accurate. Your N size is just statistical, it's just numerical, it's mathematical. What we care about when it comes to accuracy is actually weighting. We want to make sure the data are representative of the larger population. So the exit poll data becomes public after about a year or so. So we can look back at 2016, and we can see that in 2016, the exit poll data talked to about 3,157 Black respondents. That's about 12.8% of that data collection. But when we weight the data, that is, we try and ensure that the data are representative by counting some responses more than others so that it's actually representative, you see that the percentage in the sample actually goes down. It doesn't mean that it's less accurate because the sample is going down. It's actually becoming more representative statistically. So in any exit poll or any election polling data, the margin of error is one thing, but so is the weighting element. And this is kind of a more recent conversation after the election, was whether or not Trump increased his support among African-American males. And so what I did was went back and looked at 2016 to see if the increase in support from 13 percentage points is what they reported in 2016, up to 19 percentage points was actually statistically different. And when we look at it, we can see that part of the difference in the estimate is actually just due to weighting. So when you're thinking about who's in the exit poll or polling data, a part of that is understanding how weighting operates, and it can change the estimates that we make on the back end. And just to be clear, right now, just based on the exit poll data, there wasn't a significant increase among African-American males in terms of support for Trump. They had an overlapping margin of error, essentially. And the last point I want to make is that we can do more as academics and a general subgroup population about getting engaged with polling. I think a lot of our thinking about surveys comes from our being in the discipline of political science, which is not a bad thing. But sociology, communication, statistics, political science, psychology are all a part of the broader understanding of public opinion and survey methodology. And we can, if we come to the table, we can actually bring more understanding of what kinds of questions are being asked. Right now, a lot of the exit poll data we find for African Americans is relatively benign. The questions aren't interesting. We don't learn very much. If we were at the table, we would say, hey, you should maybe be thinking about these things that matter to the group as well. So I want to just point very quickly to some of the inclusion efforts that are going on in other associations that are being supported by broader organizations like Gallup and the Pew Research Center. So I just want to make those three brief points, and I look forward to talking about it even more.
Thank you, David. Next is Camille.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. Sekou, panelists, NCOBPS, all of you on this call. I know we are all completely zoomed out at this point in the semester. So I definitely appreciate your presence today. I'm going to provide a hard left from where David began his excellent commentary on understanding polls and the margin of error. Because I don't think we can understand Black Americans and the state of polling in the 2020 election without taking a short detour to understand how, historically speaking, the polling industry has treated Black Americans. Right? When we think of the issues plaguing Black Americans in contemporary polling, for example, small sample sizes, the lack of diversity in the sample, the kinds of questions being asked and the methods being used, we really can't do so without taking a look at the past. So for the brief time that I'm speaking, I'm going to talk about some of this history of polling and its more like race-oriented, racist aspects. I'll then discuss some of the difficulty with surveying Black Americans. And since I'm not a dark cloud, doom and gloom kind of gal, I'll end on a more positive note about the future of polling Black Americans. So as it pertains to the history of polling Black Americans, I'm drawing most of my notes from two reports. Number one, the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research report that's titled Researching Black American Public Opinion. And number two, a report from Gallup titled Gallup's History of Polling on Black America. And so the first point I want to make about Black Americans and the state of polling is that for far too long in the polling industry, Black people have been targets of white opinions as opposed to agents with opinions. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that if we were to go on Roper, iPoll, or Gallup, we can go all the way back to the 1930s and look at an avalanche of data pertaining to how white people feel about Black Americans, how they feel about interracial dating and bringing a Negro home for dinner, how they feel about Negroes living in their neighborhood, how they feel about Negroes in politics, giving us the right to vote, and the list goes on and on. We don't have that data for Black Americans, right? One of the earliest systematic attempts to measure the attitudes and experiences of Black Americans was conducted by W.E.B. Du Bois with the assistance of Isabel Eaton in 1896 and 1897. The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899, was based on over 5,000 interviews using structured questionnaires. Du Bois went on to conduct the first of a series of 9 studies of Black communities for the Department of Labor, including work that helped set a foundation for the field of survey research. And during the early years of polling, from 1936 to 1947, both Roper and Gallup note that there was racist bias built into these polling instruments. Why? Right? Why? The Gallup organization, which conducted the largest group of early polls and is the best source of early trends, used election participation as one of the most important criteria in setting quotas for their national adult polls. Black voices were systematically excluded from these polls because Blacks were not allowed to vote in the South and discouraged very strongly from voting in the North. These surveys contained fewer Black Americans in the general population and often none in the South, where poll taxes and other voter suppression techniques prevented voting by Black Southerners. More recently, Eric Schickler and Adam Berinsky have been working with Roper to add some weights to the very little data that their organization does have on Black Americans. It wasn't until the late 1960s, towards the end of the civil rights movement, 1969 to be exact, that pollsters started taking a more serious interest in Black public opinion. But the samples were dismal, very small, tiny. Then, as in Du Bois' time, the onus fell on Black academics and elites to produce a survey consisting of samples of Black Americans. In 1979, psychologist Kenneth Clark and Black political and business leader Percy Sutton started Data Black Public Opinion polls with the intention of conducting polls of Black Americans quarterly. The project was short-lived, but it's known as the first polling project focused exclusively on Black Americans, the first. In 1979, 114 years after 1865, this was the first to focus solely on Black public opinion. We then get a few really important surveys from academics, the National Survey of Black Americans, which was the longitudinal study conducted from 1979 to the early 1990s, the National Black Election Study, and the National Black Politics Study. We even now have a few surveys with very large samples of African Americans, but not explicitly focusing on African Americans, the National Politics Study and the CMPS, and thanking all of the scholars who are involved in that work. So why go down this road? I did so to make this simple point. Like, the polling industry has not really been invested in understanding Black public opinion in really meaningful ways, and that remains pretty much true for the most part today. Some of the only times in which we have large oversamples of Black people is when we have racial issues or discrimination dominating news coverage. Right now, we want to know how Black people feel about Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, so we ask them. Just like we wanted to know how Black people felt about the O.J. Simpson trial and the Rodney King beating. There are ebbs and flows, over samples to very little samples. So one of the things that's talked about constantly in trying to get large surveys of Black Americans are the costs. How much it costs to sample this group of people. Where are they? How can we reach them? Anyone that does survey research with Black samples knows that it costs a small fortune to recruit a large sample. So part of this issue with contemporary polling is costs. In addition to the costs, there's wide variation in polls and not a great deal of standardization. So variation in what? The length of the survey, thinking about the amount of questions, the amount of time it takes to complete the survey, the mode of the survey. Are we doing face-to-face interviews? Are we using landlines, cell phones, robocalling? Are we doing online polls? Who even has access to these different modes that we're using? Variation in the time the survey is in the field, which can range from 1 to 7 or more days. And so because there's such wide variation in these polls, it gets really difficult to discern anything meaningful from these already small samples of Black Americans. So the costs are high, the variation is wide, and sometimes the kinds of questions being asked tend not to represent the full Black experience. They lack an intersectional lens. We know a great deal about how cisgender Black folks feel about politics, but little to nothing about the LGBT+ community. We know quite a bit from the polls about how Black people feel about discrimination and very little else. Very little else. How do Black people feel about climate change? How do they feel about healthcare, wage gaps, food insecurity? We don't know very much. So the question that I keep returning to is, like, do we really want to know Black public opinion? Does the polling industry and America at large, do they really want to know how Black Americans feel and how raggedy most of us, many of us, believe this ramshackle democracy is? And if they really wanted to know, they'd make a way. All right, so I'll stop being a dark cloud. We have hope. Significant strides have been made by academics to pull together large and diverse surveys containing Black public opinion. Gallup recently started the Gallup Center on Black Voices. Pew is beginning to invest more resources in studies of Black Americans. And just this summer, the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research at Cornell launched Say Their Names, Hear Their Voices, a publicly available data collection of surveys of Black Americans and, of course, attitudes about Black America. We also have Ray Block putting in incredible work with the African American Research Collaborative. But we need to hold these polling organizations accountable. It makes no sense that we know so very much about how white Americans feel about Black people breathing, and so very little about the attitudes and behavior of Black people themselves. The polling industry really has to work hard to represent the views of minority groups in an increasingly diverse society. And we really can no longer allow them to collapse the public opinion data into white, non-white, just because the sample of racial and ethnic minorities is small. We need to be trying our hardest to include individuals and marginalized communities and their opinions so that we can be as representative as possible. Polling is an amazing tool that can be put to good use. A vote at the ballot booth only tells us who wins, but it doesn't tell us why. Knowing what people think and are expecting from their leaders is the more important aspect of polls. The purpose isn't horse race coverage. At their very best, polls give us ideas about what people are thinking about politics. They're the pulse of the people. Polls tell us what is motivating people, what people are passionate about, and all of these things harken back to democratic principles like representativeness and accountability. We need to be getting the pulse of all of the people, especially the most politically active racial and ethnic minority in the country, Black Americans. So thank you.
Thank you, Camille, for that impassioned presentation. And our final panelist is Ray Block. So Ray, you're up.
Wow, these are hard acts to follow. So the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that I'm really lucky to be on a panel with really smart people who do really amazing work. So full stop there. I just want to start with that. And a lot of what I would have covered has already been covered there. So I'm going to do something that's a little different. I'm going to talk more meta about this process. And so the way that I see it, the reason why I started working with the African American Research Collaborative was because of all of the things that have been mentioned so far. This unfair lack of attention to the preferences and decisions of African Americans was obvious. The need for more data to be collected was also obvious. Another thing that I noticed is that having nuanced interpretations of polling results also needs to be at the forefront too. And if you're paying attention on social media, people right now are just really looking for that when it comes to making sense of the results of the election. And one of the questions that keeps popping up is, why did things shake out the way that they did? Because people expected things to turn out in different ways than I guess some people actually saw. I keep going back to the idea that the predictions the whole time were that Biden would most likely win decidedly, and most likely he would be presiding over divided government. And that seems to be the case. There are people that will argue about the margins of how far or how not far the predictions went. But I keep going back to the fact that we now have results that we can interpret. And I think the interpretations are important. For example, I just can't help but not see the polarization in the country when it comes to race. And I know there's always this blame game that goes on after an election. So you see that a lot with the results for Congress, and people are like, okay, what happened with the Democrats? I'm saying what's happening with Black America and white America, because that's pretty clear. Look at the exit polls. And so I actually pulled them up because I wanted to see whether or not they were in keeping with what we expect. By and large, the way the results played out, about 6 out of 10 white respondents broke Trump. And about 9 out of 10 Black respondents broke Biden, right? And that shows up in a lot of surveys. That's a pretty robust conclusion. We can say that it's pretty clear that Biden enjoyed a really large portion of members of minority communities giving him support during the election. And Trump did a great job of unifying the white vote in 2020. That's something. I would kind of like to hear that being talked about some more. And I think that's a probably more important conversation to have than some of the conversations that we're having that look at small differences between men and women, for example, when it comes to support in minority communities. I also think another really important conversation to have is about the differences within these groups when it comes to how Trump and Biden got support. So I'm going to share my screen for a second to see if I can play some of this up. Can y'all see the page that I'm on? Any thumbs up? Somebody say yeah.
Yes.
Great, great. Okay. So shameless plug for the survey work that I've been doing with a bunch of people, but primarily with Latino Decisions and with the African American Research Collaboratives, that we had a bunch of folks to help out with this process by which we polled people in large numbers across a bunch of places nationally, and also with a bunch of states that we predicted would be influential in this election, to see how they felt about things related to the election. I keep going back to this. I'm just essentially looking at what you can get to online to look at some of the results of our poll and how consistent the white vote is for Donald Trump. And I'm saying this because there was some conversation about whether young people would make a big difference in how the election turned out. And that remains to be seen, but we know what their preferences are. And the preferences are is that among white voters, you see a lot of Trump support. And we normally like to say to people when people are thinking about the youth vote, it's really the youth vote who are African American and Latino and Asian American, Pacific Islander, and American Indian, where Biden's getting a lot of that. Biden's getting a lot of that support. And white voters look a lot like older white voters. I mean, younger white voters look a lot like older white voters when it comes to how things broke for Trump. Now, I'm sharing that primarily because I am interested in media conversations and engagement with people in the media about this really clear evidence of racial polarization and why that racial polarization matters and why we should be paying more attention to it. But those are interpretation related things. And so, as a person who's a political scientist first, who's found his way into the polling world, it's really important to me that in addition to the data being collected that we need to have so that we can speak with more confidence about what's going on in communities of color, I feel like those efforts also need to be met with proper interpretations of what those results are actually giving us. Interpretations that reflect some of the cutting edge scholarship that my panelists are doing right now. And also interpretations that allow us to get in front of, for example, some of these media narratives that go in different directions when it comes to polling results than some of the directions that I would prefer that some of these media conversations went in. And so I'm going to be really short here with that, just to simply say that this is a great panel to be on. I really do believe quite firmly what Camille says about the importance of what I'm going to call culturally competent polling. And I feel like the science of polling should meet up with the sociology of it, so to speak, so that we actually get results that help us to make more sense of race relations in the USA. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few questions in the chat. The first one is, has there been any significant research on Black male Trump voters?
So Black male Trump voters specifically, not so much just yet that I'm aware of, but what we have to realize is that Black people supporting the GOP is not new, especially in the more contemporary age, right? Historically and contemporarily speaking, Black people on average bend more conservative than they do liberal. There are some really good political scientists that have done work on this. So Teku Lee and Zoltan Hajnal, Why Americans Don't Join the Party, Tasha Philpott's work, conservative but not Republican, The Paradox of Party Identification and Ideology Among African Americans, Angela K. Lewis's work, Conservatism in the Black Community to the Right and Misunderstood. In 2016, a Pew Center survey of validated voters found that 14% of Black men supported Donald Trump. And that of those Black men, sociologist Rayshawn Ray found that many of them were highly educated, they were conservative, and they were religious, but 81% of Black men still supported Hillary Clinton, right? Of course, when you compare that to Black women, we're looking at like 98%. And when we think about what happened in 2020, as far as we can tell from some of the more recent polls, we know that the numbers increased among Black men. I think I've seen anywhere from 18 to 20% in terms of support for Donald Trump. Black women who were in the single digits, like 4% in 2016, for Hillary Clinton, now at about 8% in 2020. But there is work that Black political scientists have done, that political scientists have done, looking at conservatism among Black voters, Black people, and also support of the Republican Party. So that is there. So if anybody's looking to, build some more research upon those things that have already been done, the scholars that I mentioned have really done a deep dive into this.
Okay.
Kathie, if I
David,
just wanted to put in one more piece about that the reason why the question even comes up is because we have a false consensus about Blacks and their voting. We tend to over assume that Blacks are monolithic, and largely we tend to vote along a certain line. But the idea that somehow 20% of African-American males supporting someone who's a male like Donald Trump just arises because we tend to have a false consensus about how Blacks tend to vote. So that's part of the challenge, is having the people at the table to help say, well, that's actually not that drastically different a question. We've always seen that. You look Clarence Thomas or Alan Keyes. We can talk about this kind of thing, but there's a false consensus about how we think about things, and that speaks to the culture of surveying, not just polling industry, but surveying.
Hey, if I could piggyback off of this too, one question to ask about that is, why is the Black GOP candidate vote so stable across time, right? And so if you're getting like 1 out of every 10, pretty much every presidential election for the last 5 or so decades, the question might be, what's going on with that? That's a different question than why did Trump get X number of Black voters? This is a question about what is it about the Republican Party that has an enduring appeal to African Americans. Sorry to jump on that. I just wanted to make sure I chimed in a little bit about that.
okay, thanks. So Ronald Eaton says, I'm a Black pollster and service provider in Washington, D.C. that has serviced nearly 500 Black elected officials over the last 10 years. It is likely tougher for non-Black pollsters to create surveys that speak to issues in our community and stimulate responses from Black voters. So that's his comment. Another question is, someone asked about resending the link to the poll. So you need to tell which, because there's one link there to the Roper Center Cornell poll. If that's not what you're speaking about, please type it in the chat. Ray, can you tell us a bit about turnout and whether that changed 2016 from 2016 to 2020?
I can speculate a little bit. Turnout super high this time around. I'm waiting to see what the official results look like, but it looks like both candidates got upwards of 70 million votes. So we're looking at more than 150,000. So I'm sorry. I'm just going to start over. We're looking at what might be historically high turnout. As a person who has relatives in the Deep South, one of the things that my relatives would tell me is that it's not necessarily low turnout that's the issue, but the mechanisms by which minority votes are diluted, taken for granted, made more difficult to have an impact. Georgia, to me, is one of the examples of how, if the dynamics are such that African-American mobilization can make dents in those, in those structures, and if the electoral map is favorable to the successes of that, then you could see what are historically red states being blue. The narrative before the election week was that about Texas, but now everybody's looking at Georgia. I would say that the fact that you have large concentrations of African Americans in pockets of the Deep South gives us the opportunity, hopefully, to talk about what it means to not think about the South as being solidly red and quote unquote not worth the effort or worth the combat when it comes to mobilizing Democratic candidates and Democratic voters. And so as far as turnout changing, I feel like high turnout has something to do with the way things look in 2020. I also believe that things that were in place in Georgia that allowed the Black vote to be maximally effective had a lot to do with the outcome too. So it's not just a turnout, but the ability for turnout to translate into outcomes that might be beneficial to candidates, which I think is part of this.
If I can add one piece to it that's relevant to the conversation, and that's we won't, so there's turnout in raw number, and then there's turnout rate. And we won't know the turnout rate until we get current population or census type data. What is this? This is 2020. Maybe there's a compendium that's coming out. Hopefully it was done right. We don't know how Trump kind of did the census data, but that's how we kind of estimate turnout every election years, by looking at these broader national studies. The exit poll data doesn't really give us that accurate picture of turnout. And again, as I said, with the registered voting data, we don't get race across all the states. So we won't know the actual turnout probably till maybe June, July of next year. And so it's a really interesting question, voting age population versus registered voters turning out. Did we increase registered voters? So a lot of this stuff won't be able to be answered soon, but it's a really interesting and a good time to start asking the question so that we can start doing the right research when the data does come out.
Yeah, so David, I think you answered another question in that is looking forward to seeing turnout among Black voters this year compared with 2016. Any early indicators that this panel has seen? So I think you've spoken to that some.
All we have now, honestly, is anecdotes. You could look at, for example, the percentage of Black respondents in exit poll data, but that data is weighted up so that until we get the raw data, we don't actually know what the percentage of respondents is. And of course, the exit poll data constantly is updated as the election returns are in. It's not, the election is not actually fully done yet. So, so I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, turnout was pretty high when Obama won in 2008. And in 2012, for the first time, turnout was higher for African Americans and whites. The question becomes whether or not white turnout decreased a bit this time. Was there split ticket declines? In other words, people just not voting for any presidential candidate, but voting down the ticket for a Senate or congressional candidate. So again, these questions are kind of early to kind of answer with some level of accuracy right now, but around middle of next year, we should be able to get closer to it.
Okay, so there's a question from another journalist, Peter White. His polls seem to have been biased, but are supposed to be weighted to eliminate errors. So what went wrong? That may be for you, David.
That's what I was like, I'm giving it to David. Margin of error guru, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to share this with Ray. Okay, bias and error are two different things. We talk about bias in statistics for some things, but in survey, there's only the error that's due to certain things. Error due to sampling, error due to measurement, error due to coverage bias, error due to different sampling frames that might have different modes, modality problems, error due to interviewers, error due to random things like Comey announcing an investigation of Hillary Clinton, which is a kind of random error. So response, non-response, measurement, coverage, sampling, all of these things contribute to error. And then the most obvious thing is, of course, when you survey people last week to make a prediction about something next week, you should expect there to be error, not just due to sampling, but due to all of those other things I listed, plus random stuff. So the polls get judged by when they're wrong and get, since they're assumed to be right, because they're scientific, so to speak, they get ignored at their rate of rightness or correctness. If you look at the rate of accuracy in polls this time, they pretty much kicked butt. The ones that didn't get it right happened at the state level, and we could point to all kinds of errors related to methodology, but the larger ones are probably more likely due to the low frequency of polling in the state to understand what's going on, and maybe some issues around, accurate data collection, IVR, in-person, phone versus mail versus online panels. There's so much going on that to just call every poll the same thing, it doesn't make much sense today. Maybe in the 70s and 80s, there was just telephone and mail and in-person stuff, but now it's just unwieldy.
Okay, so there are two questions kind of on our statement and question on Georgia. Why do you think Georgia turned blue this year, but no other southern states with large Black populations? I'm thinking about Mississippi and Mike Espy's loss. Why didn't enough Black voters turn out so that he could win?
So I'm from Georgia 6. That's the district that gave us Newt Gingrich in the 90s, as well as Lucy McBath more recently. So living that transition and diversity in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, like in real time. And so one of the things that I think we can't underestimate about this election is the importance of political organizing. And of course, we've talked a great deal about Stacey Abrams and the work that she's done with Fair Vote. But there's so many organizations on the ground, especially in Georgia. Black Voters Matter, Latasha Brown, so many people in the community engagement wing of the NAACP that were doing work, especially in Georgia. And a lot of targeted attention, from what I understand from my friends that are working in these organizations, because of what they saw in that special election with John Ossoff a couple of years ago. And this idea that they were so close in that special election to flipping. And also along with, being very close in the gubernatorial election with Stacey Abrams running against Brian Kemp. So doing everything within their power to register hundreds of thousands of voters. I think the number that we're coming up with is somewhere over 800,000 voter registration. So thinking about, if we duplicate those efforts and put them in other places, like what could that look like? And so I think that when we're looking at Georgia in the long run, we'll be talking about the importance of political organization and get out the vote efforts and what that means for first-time voters, what that means for people that are more inclined to stay home and feel like politics doesn't affect them, the apathetic voters. And so I'm not aware of an extensive apparatus like that, especially in Mississippi. That's not to say it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that I'm not particularly aware of it. And thinking in the context of the Doug Jones victory, like why couldn't, I'm sorry, that was Alabama. But like in Alabama, when you had the Doug Jones victory for the special election, like why couldn't this happen in a state like Mississippi? I think in the long run, we'll be looking at political organizing. And I would love to see what like a Fair Vote or Black Voters Matter, Black Votes Matter, Black Voters Matter, other organizations really getting into Southern states, knocking on doors to see what could happen, just like what happened in Georgia, which was amazing.
So I'd like to chime in about Mississippi.
Yeah.
It's not only hard for a Black person, but it's hard for a Democrat to win a statewide election. But they have the voters voted in favor of changing the Constitution so that it would increase the chances of Blacks and Democrats in general to win in Mississippi. But yeah, along with what Camille said. So,
Hey, Professor Golden, I want to,
Yeah.
there was a question that Dr. Penderhughes asked.
yeah, I was getting to that. Okay, go on, shoot.
Okay, so what I think the competitive advantage is to organizations like Latino Decisions and like the African American Research Collaborative is that they combine ground up and top down approaches to survey construction and survey sampling and survey interpretation. So what that means is a typical academic poll, a bunch of people who study the work will get together and create a questionnaire and then go out and give it to people and then collect the results and then do the work. With the African American Research Collaborative, pretty much all of our projects start with community organizers who have interests in certain things to be queried. They'll help us to create the questionnaires, and we'll use the connections in communities of color to help us with coming up with the sample that we're going to use, and then we'll collect the data and then we'll do the analyses. And so I feel like a lot of this gets back to that cultural sensitivity that needs to be there in the enterprise of polling research. And that's one of the reasons why I really like being part of an organization that takes that into account.
Okay, are there big demographic differences across regions in Black turnout by, for example, Black women, Black men, 18 to 25-year-olds, etc.? Don't all answer at the same time.
So I haven't looked at that particularly, David. I don't know if you've been in the AAPOR data they've put together looking at that, but I'll have an answer after the holiday break. That's what I'll be spending the next 6 weeks doing. digging in that data. I did see some charts online on the internets. I don't know who put these charts together, so I can't say, with a degree of certainty where they're coming from. But I did see something from the state of Georgia about individuals who were between the ages of 18 and 34 and their turnout rates. So like thinking about both first-time voters and extremely high turnout rates among Black people in that age group in the state of Georgia that were actually among the highest in some of these subgroup categories. But outside of that graph that I saw, who I don't know put it together, I can't tell you much. But we'll be looking at all of that data, for the next few weeks and breaking it down, looking at subgroups. So hold on to that question. If you want to email me in January, I think I can have an answer for you.
Okay, so I'm a Black political scientist in South Carolina, Green. What might you say to the general public of the difference between the Quinnipiac poll that showed Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison being neck and neck in the U.S. senatorial race, but the outcome not being neck and neck at all?
The problem with those lists of polls, it was Quinnipiac and several others, is that they did not talk about the margin of error for the polls. They just talked about the gap. The gap was usually 2 points, 5 points, 7 points, but the margin of error for the surveys were usually between 3 and 7 points. And as I tried to express earlier, when you're looking at the difference, in other words, whether or not the difference between two estimates within a question, candidate A and candidate B, when you're trying to see if that difference is significantly different from 0, you double the margin of error. Not always, it depends on the distribution and other things, but you have to double it. So the error for those surveys was anywhere between, in reality, 7 and 14 or 15%. And the difference actually turned out to be within that margin. The problem is when you have the media, and that's a part of the art and science piece. The art piece is understanding that pollsters are collecting the data in the best scientific way they can, given the budget that they're given by the sponsor. They give the sponsor the data in the form of what we call top line reports, which are usually just the percentage of A and the percentage of B. And then the media and the journalists take that and create a story around just those top line. It does not include the error or much about the nuance of the methodology. And that's one of the challenges that we face with using polls to try and predict the future. Now, most people who do this stuff for a living understand this, but the public in general doesn't understand the full scope of the science. And that's a huge challenge in general.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes and I'll give each panelist 30 seconds to make a closing statement. Oh, you don't want it?
Oh, I say presentation order. I was waiting for David.
If we go in order, just my closing statement is, again, I'd encourage, faculty, graduate students, and anybody who's a professional interested in understanding more about the methodology of surveys and public opinion, and doing it within an organization that is really thinking about how to advance diversity in the discipline. The American Association for Public Opinion Researchers has an excellent set of programs that can help.
I would say when you're reading polls or when you're getting survey results, don't just read the headline, right? There's always a little tab or a little hyperlink that says, click here for more information. Always click the link and go and read about the methodology, read about how the data was collected, read about who's included in the sample. And then, draw some of your own conclusions about what to take away from the surveys. We can all be more informed consumers of surveys. That being said, there are some things that surveys cannot account for. Things like voter suppression. Right? And so also to be mindful that there are things that there is no way that we can account for in, the survey universe. And so to also be cognizant of those things as you are reading the information that you're taking in these headlines.
Okay.
I would just say that we should always remember that the enterprise of polling involves people, and those people have agency. And so there are academic reasons for why people create these instruments so that they can learn about people's preferences and self-reported decisions, right? There's also the public facing part of what polling research is. In other words, it can inform and be informed by real-time discussions about society and politics. All of that should factor into how you understand the results that you get from public opinion polls. And I say that from a perspective of someone who's neutral about the idea that pollsters have agency, because I think that's important, but I feel like it's underappreciated. Sometimes we get these numbers and we focus on the numbers outside of the context from which the numbers were created.
Thank you. So thanks to each of the panelists. I'd like to thank you who joined us on a Sunday. I know it's football day, maybe. And a big thanks to who will close us out, Sekou, for having the foresight and the tenacity to always organize these kinds of sessions. And so my challenge to all of us is to not just talk to each other, but we need to be speaking to people in the community so that they too can understand this polling thing. Sekou?
Yes, thanks to all the panelists. I greatly appreciate it. And thanks, Dr. Golden, for moderating this session. David Wilson, Camille, Burge, Ray Block. These are the best and the brightest in this field, in this area. And I encourage all of the attendees to follow them. Hopefully we can get their analyses out there more than just listening to some of the stuff that we hear on TV or read on Twitter. So greatly appreciate it. We're going to circulate this video to all of the attendees and also to the NCOBPS community. There's some questions that some individuals may have, so we may circulate them among the panelists, and if they can answer those questions, we'll get them back to the attendees. But again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. This is a great conversation, and I learned a lot too as well. So again, thank you for joining us.